There's a moment that happens sometimes. Not dramatic, not loud, not the kind of thing people tell stories about. You're sitting across from someone you've known for a long time, maybe years, maybe decades, and something in you notices that the way they land inside your inner world has shifted. Not wrong, not broken, just slightly off. Their voice is the same voice. Their face is the same face. The gestures are familiar. The rhythm of conversation is the one you've always known, and yet something in you feels a little less anchored than it used to. A little less at home. It's subtle enough that you almost miss it. Subtle enough that you tell yourself you're tired, distracted, preoccupied, overthinking. But then it happens again. A laugh that doesn't quite reach you. A story you've heard 100 times that suddenly feels like it belongs to someone else's life. A silence that feels heavier than it should. And you start to wonder, very quietly, almost embarrassed to admit it. When did we become a little bit strange to each other? It's not the kind of estrangement people usually talk about. There's no argument, no betrayal, no door slamming, no rupture you can point to and say, "That's when it happened." It's more like noticing one day that a room you've lived in your whole life has shifted a few inches to the left. Everything is still there. The furniture, the windows, the familiar corners. But your body doesn't quite know where to stand anymore. Sometimes it shows up in very small moments. You reach for your phone to tell them something, and halfway through typing, you stop. You don't know why you stopped. You just don't feel like explaining yourself. Or you're sitting next to them on the couch, and the space between your bodies feels different. Not larger, just emptier. Or you hear them say something about the world, about people, about life, and you realize your inner response is, "Oh, you think that now." And there's no judgment in it, no anger, just surprise. As if you've been living with a version of them that quietly expired and got replaced without any formal announcement. There's a strange disorientation in that, because familiarity is something we tend to take for granted. We assume it's stable, that once you've known someone deeply, they remain knowable. That intimacy is something you either have or lose in a clear, definable way. But what if it isn't like that at all? What if familiarity is more like an alignment that can drift? Two inner worlds that overlap for a while, then slowly slide out of phase. Sometimes this doesn't come from conflict at all. In fact, it often comes from growth, quiet growth, private growth. The kind that happens in the middle of the night, or in long walks, or in the aftermath of losses nobody else sees. You change a little. They change a little. Neither of you announces it. Neither of you asks permission. And then one day you look at each other and realize you're no longer standing in quite the same psychological place you used to share. It's eerie, in a way, to be surrounded by people who know your history, your childhood nickname, your old wounds, your old dreams, and still feel oddly alone in their presence. Not lonely, exactly, just unaccompanied. As if your inner life has moved into a different room in the same house, and nobody else has noticed yet. I keep thinking about alignment, about how relationships aren't just bonds between people. They're shared orbits, two inner worlds circling a common center of gravity. For a long time, the distance between them stays relatively constant, predictable, comfortable. You can reach out, metaphorically speaking, and touch the same emotional ground. You can say something that matters to you and feel it land in them. You can feel understood without having to translate yourself too much. And then, almost imperceptibly, the orbits begin to drift. A few degrees off at first, so small it doesn't register. Until one day you look up and realize you're no longer circling the same center. We're not very good at noticing slow change. We're built to respond to events, to ruptures, to dramatic shifts. We don't have good internal instruments for measuring gradual divergence. There's no relational barometer that tells you are now 12% less aligned with this person than you were 5 years ago. We just keep assuming continuity until the discrepancy becomes too large to ignore. And even then, we often reinterpret what we're feeling as something else. Stress, burnout, depression, midlife restlessness, hormones, pandemic fatigue, anything but the simple, disquieting recognition that someone who used to feel intimately familiar to you no longer does. I think that's why this experience often shows up first as irritation or boredom. You find yourself inexplicably annoyed by things that never bothered you before. The way they chew, the way they tell stories, the way they repeat themselves, the way they see the world. And you feel guilty for that annoyance, because it feels petty and ungrateful. You tell yourself you're just in a bad mood, that you need more sleep, that you're being unfair. But beneath the irritation, there's often something much more existential happening. A subtle sense that the psychological bridge between you has weakened, and your nervous system is registering that loss of resonance as discomfort. There's a scene that plays out in many relationships, though we rarely name it. You're in the middle of a conversation that should feel connecting. You're talking about something that matters to you, something that feels alive and important in your inner world, and you can tell, in the smallest ways, that it's not landing in the other person. Their eyes glaze just a little, their responses become generic, their attention drifts, and you feel this tiny internal contraction, a sense of pulling back, of closing a door you didn't even realize was open. And in that moment, you make a micro-adjustment. You simplify your thought. You change the subject. You joke it away. You downplay what you were about to say. You file this topic away as something you no longer bring to this person. And you don't make a big deal out of it. You don't consciously register it as estrangement. You just adapt. Quietly, automatically, like a relational muscle learning a new range of motion. And then that happens again and again, until one day you realize that large parts of your inner life are no longer shared with this person at all. Not because you're hiding them, not because they would disapprove, just because there's no longer a felt sense that they would really receive them. And that realization lands in you with a peculiar kind of sadness. Not sharp, not dramatic, just hollow. There's something deeply disorienting about realizing that someone can love you and still not really know you anymore. Or maybe it's more accurate to say, not know the version of you that you've become. They know your history, your biography, your old wounds, your old dreams. But they don't quite have access to your current inner world, the way you now experience things, the way you now think about life, the questions that now keep you awake at night, and you don't blame them for that. How could you? You haven't exactly sat them down and said, "Here is the updated version of my psyche. Please install it." You've just changed, quietly, in ways that are hard to articulate, in ways that don't have obvious outward markers. There's a moment, often a small one, when you realize you're carrying two versions of a person in your mind, the one they used to be to you, and the one they are now. And those two versions don't quite reconcile. You find yourself reacting emotionally to the old version while interacting behaviorally with the new one. And that dissonance creates this low-grade, persistent sense of unreality. It's like listening to a song that's been subtly retuned. The melody is still recognizable. The lyrics are the same, but the key has shifted just enough that your body can't quite relax into it the way it used to. You keep waiting for the familiar emotional resolution that never quite arrives. There's a particular kind of sadness in realizing that the person you used to be with, someone no longer exists. and that the person they used to be with you no longer exists either, and that the relationship itself, its original form, its original emotional logic has quietly died, even though the two of you are still very much alive. It's like being haunted by a relationship that still exists. There's a moment that comes, sometimes unexpectedly, when you realize that you no longer feel emotionally safe in the same way with someone you used to trust completely. Not because they've betrayed you, not because they've hurt you, but because you don't feel confident anymore that they can really hold the person you've become. And that realization creates this subtle but persistent anxiety in the relationship. You start monitoring yourself more, editing yourself more. You become hyper-aware of which parts of you feel welcome and which parts feel awkward or inconvenient. And that self-monitoring quietly erodes intimacy, because intimacy depends, at its core, on the assumption that you don't have to curate your inner world too carefully for the other person. And when that assumption breaks, even in small ways, the relationship changes its emotional texture. I keep circling back to the idea that intimacy is not a stable achievement. It's a dynamic alignment, a moving overlap between two evolving inner worlds. And when that overlap thins, history alone can't carry the weight of connection anymore. Memory becomes a thin thread stretched across an expanding distance. There's something almost cruel about how ordinary this experience is. How many people are living with this quiet estrangement right now, without having any language for it, without having any cultural container for it, without having any idea whether what they're feeling is normal or pathological or temporary or permanent? Because there's no language for it, there's also no community for it. You feel alone in it. You assume everyone else's relationships are somehow more intact, more alive, more aligned than yours. You don't realize how many people are quietly carrying the same sense of relational dislocation. I think about the pandemic sometimes, and how it accelerated certain psychological shifts that were already underway. How many people emerged from those years with different values, different priorities, different existential sensibilities. How many relationships quietly changed because the people in them changed in ways that were never fully processed or integrated into the relational fabric. And now, years later, people are living in relational worlds that no longer quite fit who they've become. And they don't know why things feel off. They just know that something has. There's a moment that comes in some relationships when you realize that you and the other person no longer inhabit the same emotional reality. You might be grieving something they don't recognize as a loss. You might be questioning things they take for granted. You might be seeking depth at a moment when they're seeking comfort or distraction. And you start to feel like you're speaking across a widening gap, and you don't know how to bridge it, because you don't even know exactly what's creating it. I notice how often we interpret this kind of misalignment as a failure of communication. We just need to talk more. We need to be more honest. We need to open up. And sometimes that helps. Sometimes it really does. But sometimes it doesn't, because the problem isn't that you're not communicating enough. It's that your inner worlds are no longer structured in ways that make deep, mutual understanding easy or natural. And no amount of talking can fully bridge that kind of structural divergence. That's a hard thing to accept. It threatens our sense of agency in relationships. It suggests that there are limits to what effort and intention can accomplish, that there are forces at work in our psychological development that are not fully under our control. And when you start to sense those limits, something in you feels very small and very vulnerable. Because if even your most important relationships are subject to these kinds of quiet, impersonal shifts, then what, exactly, is stable in life? There's a clock ticking somewhere near you right now, or maybe a distant car passing by, or the low hum of electricity in the walls. Small, ordinary sounds, life continuing in its usual way, and here you are, thinking about people who are still in your life, still reachable, still present, and yet somehow not where you are anymore. There's a cafe scene that keeps returning to me. Not because it was dramatic, not because anything went wrong, just because of how quietly revealing it was. I was sitting across from someone I've known for a long time, someone I care about deeply. The light coming through the window had that late afternoon quality, gray and soft and slightly dim, like the day was already folding itself inward. We were talking about ordinary things, work, other people, plans, the kinds of things you talk about when everything is supposed to be fine. And at some point, they laughed at something I said, and the sound of their laughter caught my attention in a strange, disorienting way. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't unpleasant. It just didn't feel like the laughter I remembered. And for a split second, I had this quiet, almost silly thought. When did your laugh become someone else's? I didn't say anything, of course. You don't say things like that. You file them away in that inner drawer labeled probably nothing. But it stayed with me, not as sadness, more like a soft ache of recognition. Like noticing a crack in a wall that doesn't threaten the house, but changes how you see the room forever. We finished our coffee. We hugged goodbye. We said all the familiar things. Let's do this again soon. Take care. Text me when you get home. And from the outside, everything looked completely normal. But inside, something had shifted, not dramatically. Just enough to make me feel a little less anchored in that relationship than I used to be. And I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I didn't know if it meant anything. I didn't know if it was temporary. I didn't know if it was something I should try to fix, or accept, or ignore. So I did what most of us do with experiences we don't have language for. I carried it quietly. I folded it into my daily life. I went to work. I answered messages. I showed up to other relationships, and somewhere underneath all of that, there was this faint, persistent sense that something fundamental in my relational world had shifted. It's like living in a house where the floor is very slightly tilted. Not enough to notice all the time. Not enough to make anything fall over, but enough that your body always feels just a little bit off balance, even when everything looks normal. I keep returning to that image of orbits. Two bodies circling a shared center of gravity. For a long time, the distance between them remains relatively constant, predictable, comfortable, and then, for reasons that have nothing to do with intention or effort, the orbit begins to decay. The center of gravity shifts. The speeds change. The trajectories diverge. And what once felt like stable companionship becomes a slow, widening gap. And the strangest part is that from the outside, nothing seems to be happening. There's no explosion, no collision, no dramatic separation. Just a quiet increase in distance that only the two bodies involved can feel. And that's where we are right now. In that quiet increase in distance, in that strange, uncanny space where someone you love is still right there, still reachable, still part of your life, and yet somehow not quite where you are anymore. I don't know what to do with that yet. I'm not even sure what it means. I just know that it's real, and that it matters, and that we don't talk about it enough. And maybe for now, that's enough. Just to notice it. Just to let it be what it is. Without rushing to explain it. Without rushing to fix it. Without rushing to decide what it means for the future. Just letting the strangeness remain strange. Letting the misalignment be misalignment. Letting the distance be distance. And staying with that, here, for a little while longer. There's a second layer to this experience that only reveals itself after you've been living with that quiet misalignment for a while. After you've noticed the thinning familiarity. After you've felt the subtle distance growing between you and people you still love. It's the moment when you realize that the estrangement isn't just happening in one relationship. It's happening everywhere. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a slow, cumulative way. You start to feel like a guest in rooms you used to own, like you're visiting houses that still carry your name on the mailbox, but no longer quite feel like home. It shows up with your parents, sometimes. You're sitting at the same kitchen table you've been sitting at your whole life. The same chairs, the same mugs, the same routines. They ask you the same kinds of questions. They tell the same kinds of stories. And something in you notices that the emotional room you're standing in with them has changed shape. You find yourself choosing your words more carefully, not because they're dangerous, not because they're judgmental, but because you don't quite know how to translate who you are now into the relational language you've always used with them. You talk about work, logistics, health, other people, safe topics, and you feel this subtle grief for the conversations you're not having, the parts of your inner world you don't even attempt to bring into this room anymore. It's not that your parents wouldn't care, it's that you no longer feel confident they would recognize the person you've become. And that's a strange thing to feel about the people who knew you before you had any conscious identity at all. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your parents are still relating to a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. They still see the child, the teenager, the young adult, the version of you that needed their approval, their guidance, their protection, and you don't know how to correct that image without creating a kind of relational rupture that feels unnecessary and cruel. So you let them keep seeing the old version. And in doing that, you quietly exile your current self from that relationship. It shows up with your adult children too, if you have them, or with younger people who look to you in parental or mentoring ways. You realize that they're building their understanding of you based on the role you play in their lives, not on who you actually are internally. They see the caretaker, the provider, the emotional anchor, the responsible one. They don't see the questions that keep you awake at night. They don't see the grief you carry about paths not taken. They don't see the uncertainty you feel about the life you've built. And you don't show them those things because it feels destabilizing, because it feels selfish, because it feels like you're burdening them with your existential weight. So again, you live a split life, the relational version of you and the inner version of you. And the distance between those two selves starts to feel like its own kind of homelessness. It shows up with friends, too. Especially long-term friends, the ones who have known you through multiple chapters of your life. You meet for dinner, or coffee, or walks, and you fall into the same conversational grooves you've always had, the same jokes, the same shared memories, the same ways of relating, and it all works. It's pleasant, it's warm, it's familiar. And yet something in you feels oddly undernourished by it. You leave those encounters feeling more tired than you used to feel, more empty, less seen. And you don't understand why, because nothing bad happened. Nobody was unkind, nobody was dismissive, nobody was absent. And yet you feel like you just spent 2 hours performing a version of yourself that no longer exists. There's a moment, often very small, when you realize that you're no longer really bringing your full self into these relationships, not because you're hiding, not because you're lying, but because you've learned, implicitly, that certain parts of you don't really belong in these rooms anymore. Your questions, your doubts, your changing values, your emerging sensibilities, your growing disinterest in things that used to matter to you, your longing for depth when everyone else seems content with surface, and so you quietly remove those parts of yourself at the threshold, like taking off muddy shoes before entering a house, except in this case, you're taking off parts of your inner life. And after a while, you start to forget what it feels like to walk into a relationship fully intact. That's when the homelessness starts to register. Not homelessness in the literal sense, but a kind of relational homelessness. A sense that there is no longer any room in your life where you can bring your whole inner world and feel it be held, recognized, and received. You have houses, you have rooms, you have places where you are welcome, but none of them quite feel like home. And that creates a very particular kind of grief. Not the grief of losing people, but the grief of losing the emotional geography you used to inhabit with them. It's like waking up one day and realizing that all the streets in your hometown have been subtly rearranged overnight. The buildings are still there. The landmarks are still there. But your internal map no longer matches the terrain. You keep turning down streets that no longer lead where you expect them to. You keep reaching for emotional rooms that no longer exist, and you feel this constant, low-grade sense of disorientation. I think this is one of the hidden experiences of midlife, not the dramatic crises, not the affairs or divorces or career changes, but this quieter realization that the relational world you built your identity inside no longer fits who you are, and that there's no obvious replacement for it. You're too old to start over completely, too young to settle into a finished story. You're in this strange, liminal phase where your old rooms feel too small, and your new rooms haven't been built yet. And so you wander through your own life feeling like a visitor. There's a particular moment that comes, sometimes in your 40s or 50s or 60s, when you realize that the social world you belong to no longer reflects your inner world at all. You look around at the conversations people are having, the things they're excited about, the things they're afraid of, the values they organize their lives around, and you feel like you've somehow drifted into the wrong movie. Not in a superior way, not in a judgmental way, just in a bewildered way. You don't recognize the script anymore, and you don't know how to improvise a new one. You start to feel like a foreigner in your own culture, like you're living in a psychological diaspora, exiled not geographically, but existentially. And again, you don't know what to do with that feeling. You don't know where to go. You don't know who to talk to. You just know that the world you're living in no longer feels like it was designed for the person you've become. And that creates a deep, quiet kind of loneliness. The kind that doesn't come from being alone. The kind that comes from being misplaced, from being unhomed, from being relationally unsituated. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you're no longer really oriented toward the future in the same way you used to be. You don't have the same sense of momentum, the same sense of forward movement, the same sense of building towards something. Instead, you feel like you're living in the afterlife of decisions you made a long time ago, living in a house built by a younger version of yourself. And now you're walking through its rooms realizing that they no longer fit your body. The ceilings feel too low. The windows feel too small. The layout feels wrong. And you don't know how to renovate it without tearing the whole thing down. There's a quiet terror in that realization, because tearing the whole thing down feels impossible. You have responsibilities, commitments, people who depend on you, structures that require your participation. And so you live in a house that no longer fits, and you call it stability, and you tell yourself you should be grateful, and you feel guilty for wanting something else. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your entire life is organized around values that no longer feel true to you. You built your career based on what mattered to you at 30. You built your relationships based on what mattered to you at 25. You built your social world based on what mattered to you at 40. And now you're living in a life that reflects an outdated version of your psyche. And you don't know how to update it. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes with that. An identity vertigo. You don't know who you are anymore in relation to the world. You don't know what your life is about. You don't know what you're moving toward. You don't know what you're allowed to want. And that uncertainty destabilizes everything. Because identity is not something we carry inside ourselves in isolation. It's co-created in relationship. It's reflected back to us by the people and structures we live inside. And when those relational mirrors no longer match who we are, our sense of self starts to fray. We start to feel unreal, unanchored, discontinuous, like we're living someone else's life. There's something quietly tragic about how many people are living this way right now, carrying a deep sense of misalignment, carrying a quiet grief for a life that no longer feels like theirs, carrying a loneliness they don't know how to name, and blaming themselves for it, thinking they're ungrateful, thinking they're broken, thinking they're incapable of intimacy, thinking they're having a midlife crisis, when sometimes they're just outgrowing the relational containers they're living in. And we don't have a cultural script for that. We don't have a way of acknowledging it without turning it into a moral failure, without turning it into a betrayal of the people who have been there for us, without turning it into a selfish refusal to accept reality. So people live in quiet estrangement, and they call it normal, and they call it maturity, and they call it stability, and they tell themselves this is just what adulthood feels like. And maybe sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's just relational homelessness masquerading as normality. There's a moment that comes, sometimes late at night, when you're lying in bed and you realize that there is no one in your life who really knows who you are anymore. Not in the deep, existential sense. You're known in your roles, as a partner, as a parent, as a colleague, as a friend, as a sibling, but not as the person you've become. Not as the person who carries the questions you now carry, the fears you now carry, the longings you now carry. And that realization lands in you with a kind of quiet devastation. Not sharp, not dramatic, just heavy. Like realizing you're living in a house where none of the rooms are yours anymore. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've been editing yourself so habitually that you no longer know what you actually think and feel. You've learned, implicitly, which parts of you are welcome in which rooms, which parts of you belong with which people, which parts of you need to be left at the door, and after a while, you forget which parts are actually yours. You forget what it feels like to speak without translation, to express without self-monitoring, to exist without curation. And that creates a kind of internal estrangement that mirrors the external one. You become a stranger to yourself. And that amplifies the homelessness. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you're no longer really living in the present of your relationships. You're living in their past, in your memory of how they used to feel. And you keep trying to recreate that past in the present. You keep initiating the same kinds of conversations, making the same kinds of jokes, reaching for the same kinds of intimacy. And it keeps not quite working. And instead of accepting that the relational world has changed, you interpret the failure as something you're doing wrong. You think, if I just try harder, if I just communicate better, if I just open up more, if I just stop being so sensitive, if I just lower my expectations, and you exhaust yourself trying to revive a relational form that no longer exists. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving people who no longer feel familiar. Not because love itself is exhausting, but because the emotional labor of maintaining a sense of connection in the absence of resonance is enormous. You're constantly compensating, constantly translating, constantly adjusting, constantly smoothing over misalignments, and over time, that compensation drains you. It leaves you feeling strangely depleted after interactions that used to nourish you. And again, You don't necessarily interpret this as estrangement. You just think, I'm tired, I'm burned out, I'm depressed, I'm overwhelmed. And maybe you are all of those things. But maybe some of that exhaustion is relational. Maybe it's the cost of living in a relational world that no longer fits who you are. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your entire social world no longer feels like it belongs to you. You go to gatherings, parties, family events, work functions, and you feel like you're performing a role in a play that no longer makes sense to you. You say the right things, you laugh at the right times, you follow the script, and inside, you feel like you're watching yourself from a distance, like you're not really there. And that creates this eerie sense of dissociation, of living in a life that doesn't quite feel like yours anymore. I keep thinking about that image of houses and rooms, about how relationships are not just emotional bonds, they're psychological spaces, rooms we inhabit together. And when those rooms no longer fit who you are, you start to feel cramped, claustrophobic, restless, not because the people in them are wrong, not because the rooms are objectively bad, just because you've grown in a direction they weren't designed to accommodate. And that's nobody's fault. It's just a consequence of time and change. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've been living your life on autopilot for years. Not because you're lazy, not because you're unconscious, but because you didn't know how to consciously renegotiate your relational world. You didn't know how to bring your evolving inner world into dialogue with the relationships you were living in. So you just kept going, kept functioning, kept performing your roles. And now you're waking up to the fact that your life no longer feels like yours. And that realization lands in you with a kind of existential shock. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quietly devastating. And you don't know where to start. You don't know what to change. You don't know what to keep. You don't know what to let go of. You just know that something fundamental is misaligned. And that misalignment is not going to resolve itself. There's something else that feels important to name here. The way estrangement can happen not just between you and other people, but between you and your entire life. When you live in relational worlds that no longer fit who you are, your life itself starts to feel foreign. Your routines, your habits, your obligations, your structures, they all start to feel like they belong to someone else. And that creates a very deep, very quiet kind of despair. Not the kind that makes you want to die. The kind that makes you feel like you're already living in the afterlife of your own life. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you don't quite recognize yourself anymore. Not because you've become someone terrible, not because you've lost your values, but because you've been living in misalignment for so long that you've lost touch with your own inner truth. You've been editing yourself, performing yourself, translating yourself, and now you don't know what your unedited self even sounds like, and that realization creates a kind of panic. Because if you don't know who you are anymore, how do you decide what to do with your life? How do you decide which relationships to keep? Which paths to follow? Which risks to take? There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've been postponing your real life, not consciously, not deliberately, but because you didn't know how to bring your real self into the life you were living. So you told yourself, later, when things settle down, when the kids are older, when work is less demanding, when I have more time. And now, years have passed, and things haven't settled down, and you still don't have more time. And you're still waiting. And you start to feel this deep, aching grief for a life you haven't lived yet. A life that still feels possible in some abstract way, but no longer feels accessible in any concrete way. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your entire existence has become a kind of holding pattern. You're not moving forward. You're not moving backward. You're just circling, waiting for something to change, waiting for clarity, waiting for permission, waiting for a sign, and nothing comes, and you start to feel trapped in your own life, not by external constraints, but by your own uncertainty about who you are and what you're allowed to want. There's something quietly heartbreaking about that, about how many people are living in this kind of existential limbo, carrying a deep sense of misalignment, carrying a grief they don't know how to name, carrying a loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, and doing it all in silence, because they don't want to seem ungrateful, they don't want to hurt the people they love, they don't want to blow up their lives, so they just endure, and they call it maturity, and they call it responsibility, and they call it realism, and they tell themselves this is just what adulthood feels like. And maybe sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's just relational homelessness, and existential dislocation, and identity vertigo, masquerading as normality. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've outgrown the relational containers you're living in, not because you've become better than the people in them, not because you've become more evolved or more enlightened, just because you've changed in ways that no longer fit those containers, and you don't know what to do with that. Because there's no socially acceptable way to say, I've outgrown my life. There's no way to say that without sounding selfish or ungrateful or delusional. So you keep it to yourself, and you live in the quiet grief of that realization. There's an image that keeps coming to me, of someone building a small house when they're young, a house that fits their body at that time, their needs, their dreams, their sense of what life is about, and then they grow. Their body changes, their inner world changes, their values change, their sense of what matters changes, and they're still living in that same small house. And they don't know how to expand it, they don't know how to rebuild it, they don't know how to move. So they just crouch. They bend themselves to fit. They bump their head on the ceiling. They squeeze through doorways that are too narrow, and over time, they start to forget that there was ever any other way to live. They start to think the discomfort is just what life feels like. And that's when the homelessness becomes invisible. It becomes normalized. It becomes the background noise of existence. And people live entire lives like that, never quite at home anywhere, never quite belonging anywhere, never quite fitting anywhere, and never quite knowing why. There's something about that that feels unbearably sad. Not in a dramatic, tragic way, in a quiet, ordinary, deeply human way. And that sadness doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't demand rupture. It doesn't demand transformation. It just demands to be acknowledged, to be named, to be allowed to exist as a real experience, without being minimized, without being pathologized, without being rushed into resolution. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do with estrangement is to stop pretending it isn't happening. To stop telling yourself it's just stress or burnout or moodiness or ingratitude, and to let yourself feel the grief of living in a life that no longer fits who you are. And maybe for now, that's enough. Just to notice the homelessness. Just to let it be what it is. Just to stop blaming yourself for it. Just to stop trying to explain it away. Just letting it be real. Here. In your life. In your relationships. In your body. Without rushing to decide what it means. Without rushing to decide what to do about it. Without rushing to turn it into a moral story. Just staying with the dislocation. Staying with the vertigo. Staying with the homelessness. For a little while longer. There comes a point, usually after you've been living with that sense of relational homelessness for a while, when something in you begins to turn inward. Not in a dramatic way, not as a conscious decision, just as a quiet reorientation of attention. You notice that you're spending more time alone than you used to, or at least wanting to. You start declining invitations that once felt obligatory. You stop reaching out to people just to fill the silence. You find yourself lingering longer in empty rooms, in quiet walks, in moments where there's no one else around to mirror you back to yourself. At first, you might interpret this as depression, or burnout, or withdrawal. But if you pay closer attention, there's something else happening underneath it. It's not just that you're tired of people. It's that the social world you've been living in no longer feels like a place where your inner life can breathe. And so your psyche starts seeking a different kind of space. A quieter one. A less populated one. A less performative one. There's a strange relief in that shift. A sense of loosening, as if you've been holding your breath in your relationships for a long time, and now, in solitude, your lungs are finally allowed to expand fully. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to translate your thoughts. You don't have to monitor your tone. You don't have to edit your questions. You don't have to pretend to be interested in things that no longer interest you. You don't have to perform a version of yourself that no longer exists. And that relief is so palpable that it startles you. It makes you realize how much effort your social life has been costing you. How much invisible labor you've been doing just to maintain a sense of relational coherence. And in solitude, all of that labor falls away. There's a moment that comes, sometimes late at night or early in the morning, when you're alone in your home and the world feels very far away. The lights are dim, the sounds are muted, the pace of time feels different, and you realize that this quiet is not empty. It's full of your own thoughts, your own sensations, your own emotional weather, and for the first time in a long time, you're not filtering any of it through anyone else's expectations. You're just with yourself. And that feels both terrifying and strangely comforting. Because on the one hand, you're confronted with how little company you actually have inside your own inner world. How unfamiliar you've become to yourself. How much of your psychic energy has been organized around other people. On the other hand, there's this faint, surprising sense of coming home. As if you've been living in exile from your own interiority, and now you're slowly making your way back. I keep thinking about exile, not the dramatic kind, where you're forcibly removed from your homeland, but the quieter kind, where you slowly drift away from your own inner territory without quite realizing it. You spend so many years living in relational worlds that no longer fit who you are that you lose touch with the part of yourself that knows what home even feels like. And then one day, you find yourself alone in a room, and something in you recognizes the quiet as familiar. Not comfortable, not easy, but familiar. As if your psyche is saying, "Ah, this is where I live now." And that recognition is deeply unsettling, because it suggests that your true home is no longer in your relationships, it's in your solitude. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you feel more real when you're alone than when you're with other people. Not happier, not more fulfilled, just more authentic, more aligned with your inner truth. And that realization lands in you with a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief, because you finally found a space where you don't have to contort yourself to fit. Grief, because it means that the relational world you've been living in is no longer capable of holding who you are. And again, you don't know what to do with that, because solitude is not a sustainable relational structure. You can't build a life entirely out of being alone. You're not meant to. You're a relational being. Your psyche is designed to exist in connection with others. And yet here you are, finding your deepest sense of coherence in your aloneness. And that contradiction feels unbearable. There's a particular kind of loneliness that only appears in solitude. Not the loneliness of being isolated. The loneliness of realizing that your inner world has no obvious place to go in the world of other people. You might find yourself sitting alone at night, scrolling through your phone, looking at other people's lives, and feeling this strange sense of being fundamentally out of sync with the human world. Not superior, not inferior, just out of phase. As if everyone else is moving to a rhythm you no longer hear. And you don't know how to rejoin the dance. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've become a kind of island, not cut off by walls, not isolated by conflict, just separated by invisible waters of psychological difference. You can see the mainland, you can communicate with it, you can visit it, but you don't quite belong to it anymore, and you don't know where your island came from. You don't remember choosing to live there. You just woke up one day and realized that this is where you are. And there's something both peaceful and terrifying about that. Peaceful, because islands are quiet. Terrifying, because islands are alone. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that the social world you're living in no longer reflects your inner world at all. You look at the conversations people are having, the concerns that animate them, the values they organize their lives around. And you feel like you're watching a foreign culture. Not in a judgmental way, in a bewildered way. You don't recognize the emotional language anymore. You don't recognize the priorities. You don't recognize the sense of urgency. And you start to feel like you're living in a psychological diaspora, exiled not geographically, but existentially. And that sense of cultural dislocation deepens your solitude, because now it's not just that your relationships don't fit, it's that the world itself doesn't fit. And you don't know where to go with that. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've outgrown the life you're living. Not in the sense that you've become too big for it, in the sense that your inner world has developed in directions that your life has no structures to accommodate. Your questions have become more existential. Your values have become more subtle. Your sense of what matters has shifted, and your life is still organized around a much earlier version of your psyche. And that creates this deep, gnawing sense of dissonance, like wearing clothes that used to fit perfectly and now feel constricting everywhere. You keep adjusting them, pulling at them, trying to make them more comfortable, and nothing works. Because the problem isn't the clothes, it's that your body has changed. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you don't actually belong to the social identity you've been living inside. Your profession, your family role, your community role, your cultural role, they all feel like costumes you've been wearing for so long that you forgot they weren't your skin. And now they're starting to itch. And you don't know how to take them off, because you don't know what you'd be without them. And that creates this deep existential anxiety. Because if you're not who you've been, then who are you? And where do you belong? There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not a symptom, it's a response to living in a relational world that no longer fits who you are, a response to being misrecognized everywhere you go, a response to carrying an inner world that has no obvious relational home. And that reframing changes how you experience your aloneness. It stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling like a psychological necessity. Not a solution, not a destination, but a temporary refuge. A place where your psyche can rest from the labor of misalignment. There's a strange dignity in that, in choosing, consciously or unconsciously, to step back from relational worlds that are draining you. In choosing to inhabit your own interiority for a while. In choosing to be with yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. even when it's lonely, even when it's frightening. There's something quietly courageous about that. Not in a heroic way, in a deeply human way. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you're no longer really afraid of being alone. You're afraid of never finding a place in the world where you can belong as the person you've become. And that's a very different fear. It's not the fear of isolation, it's the fear of existential homelessness. The fear that there is no relational world that can hold your inner world anymore. And that fear can make solitude feel both safer and more terrifying at the same time. Safer, because at least you don't have to keep editing yourself. More terrifying, because it raises the question of whether your solitude is going to become permanent. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you've been living in psychological time rather than chronological time. Your body has aged. The years have passed. But your inner life has been living in a different temporal rhythm. You've been carrying old questions into new decades. You've been holding unresolved griefs for years. You've been postponing parts of your life that never quite arrived. And now you're waking up to the fact that your inner world and your outer world are no longer synchronized in time. You feel both older and younger than you are. Older, because you carry so much unprocessed experience. Younger, because you haven't lived the life you thought you would by this age. And that temporal dislocation deepens your sense of not belonging. Because now you don't even feel at home in your own age. You feel like a temporal exile, living in the wrong decade of your own life. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not empty, it's populated. Populated by your own thoughts, your own memories, your own longings, your own questions, your own unlived lives. And that realization is overwhelming, because it means that you've been avoiding yourself for a long time. And now, in solitude, you can't avoid yourself anymore. You're forced to meet the person you've become. And that meeting is not always pleasant. There's grief there, regret, anger, longing, fear, confusion. But there's also something else, a strange sense of truth. A sense that this is who you actually are now. Not the person you perform in your relationships. Not the person you present to the world, but the person who exists in the quiet of your own interiority. And that truth has a certain gravity. It pulls you inward. It makes you less interested in superficial connection, less tolerant of misalignment, less willing to live in relational worlds that require constant self-editing. And that gravity deepens your solitude, because it makes it harder to go back to the way things were. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is teaching you something, not in the sense of a lesson, not in the sense of a moral, but in the sense of a deep, embodied knowing. It's teaching you what it feels like to exist without external mirrors, what it feels like to be with your own consciousness, without distraction. What it feels like to carry your own inner world without immediately trying to share it or explain it or make it relational. And that experience changes you. It makes you less dependent on external validation, less desperate for connection at any cost, less willing to contort yourself to fit into relational spaces that no longer resonate with you. And that change makes it even harder to return to your old relational world, because now you've tasted a kind of inner coherence that you didn't have before. And you don't want to give it up. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not just a refuge, it's a threshold. A liminal space between your old relational world and whatever new relational world might one day emerge. And you don't know what's on the other side of that threshold. You don't know if there is another side. You just know that you can't go back. And that realization is terrifying. because it means that your life is genuinely in transition, not in a dramatic, visible way, but in a deep, existential way. And you don't have any maps for this territory. You don't have any cultural scripts. You don't have any models. You're just here, in the quiet, in the in-between, in the exile, in the homelessness, in the solitude, and you don't know what it's leading to. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not something you chose. It's something that chose you, a response to a life that no longer fits, a response to relationships that no longer hold you, a response to a world that no longer feels like home. And that reframing softens something in you. It takes the edge off the self-blame. It takes the edge off the sense of failure. It allows you to see your aloneness as a form of psychological intelligence, not a pathology, not a defect, not a weakness, but an adaptive response to misalignment. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not the opposite of belonging. It's the precondition for a deeper kind of belonging that hasn't found its form yet. And that idea is both comforting and unbearably sad. Comforting, because it suggests that your exile is not meaningless. Sad, because it offers no timeline, no guarantees, no clear path forward, just the quiet, uncertain promise that something new might one day emerge from this emptiness. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your inner world is larger than your outer world, that your consciousness has expanded beyond the structures of your life, that your questions have outgrown your relationships, that your values have outgrown your routines. And that mismatch creates this deep, existential pressure, like a balloon expanding inside a rigid box. Something has to give, and you don't know what. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not just about you. It's about the limits of relational worlds, about the fact that no relationship, no matter how loving, can fully contain an evolving psyche. About the fact that human connection is always, inevitably, partial. About the fact that inner worlds diverge, and that divergence creates loneliness even in the presence of love. And that truth is unbearably sad, and strangely relieving, because it takes some of the moral weight off your estrangement. It allows you to see it as a structural feature of being human, not a personal failure, not a relational defect, not a sign that something is wrong with you or the people in your life. Just a consequence of time and change. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is teaching you how to be with uncertainty, how to live without a clear narrative, how to exist without a stable identity, how to carry questions that have no answers. And that capacity is not something our culture values very much. We're taught to seek clarity, resolution, certainty, direction. And here you are, being trained by your own life to do the opposite, to live in ambiguity, to live in not knowing, to live in the in-between. And that training is deeply uncomfortable and deeply transformative. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not something you need to escape from. It's something you need to inhabit fully, not forever, not as a permanent state, but as a necessary phase in your psychological development, a phase where your inner world catches up to itself, where your psyche metabolizes its own growth, where your consciousness integrates its own expansion. And that reframing changes how you experience your aloneness. It stops feeling like a punishment and starts feeling like a pilgrimage, not to a holy place, but to your own interiority. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is the only place where you can really hear yourself think. Not the thoughts you perform for others, not the thoughts shaped by social expectations, but the quieter, deeper thoughts that emerge when there's no one else around to witness you. And those thoughts are often unsettling. They raise questions you don't know how to answer. They surface desires you don't know how to fulfill. They bring griefs you don't know how to process. But they're also the most honest thoughts you have. And that honesty has a certain gravity. It draws you further into your solitude. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not empty space. It's fertile space. A psychological fallow period. A time when your old identity is decomposing and your new identity hasn't formed yet. And that in-between state feels like death. Because something has died. The person you used to be. The life you used to live. The relational world you used to inhabit. And something new is trying to be born. But it's not ready yet. And you're stuck in the waiting room. And that waiting is excruciating. Because you don't know what you're waiting for. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not just about you. It's about the limits of human connection. About the fact that no one can walk your inner journey for you. About the fact that there are aspects of your consciousness that are fundamentally unshareable. And that realization deepens your loneliness. But it also deepens your sense of dignity. Because it means that your inner life is not something that can be fully consumed or colonized by anyone else. It belongs to you, and that belonging matters. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is changing how you relate to other people. You become less interested in superficial connection, less tolerant of misalignment, less willing to perform, less willing to edit yourself. And that makes your old relational world feel even more foreign, because now you're carrying a level of psychological honesty that it doesn't know how to receive, and that deepens your exile. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is not a mistake. It's a stage, a necessary passage in your psychological development, a dark night of the soul, not in a religious sense, in an existential sense, a time when your old meanings have collapsed and your new meanings haven't formed yet. And that reframing gives your suffering a different texture. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes it feel less pointless. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude is asking something of you, not action, not decisions, not transformation, but presence. The willingness to be with your own inner world without rushing to escape it, without rushing to fix it, without rushing to distract yourself from it. And that presence is unbelievably difficult, because everything in you wants to run, to numb, to connect, to fill the emptiness, to go back to the familiar. But something in you knows that if you run now, you'll only delay what your psyche is trying to do. And so, you stay. In the quiet, in the exile, in the homelessness, in the solitude. And you don't know what it's leading to. You just know that you can't go back. And that you don't yet know how to go forward. And that you're here, now, in this strange, liminal place. And that has to be enough. For now. There is a different kind of attention that arrives when you stop trying to solve what's happening to you. Not the sharp, effortful kind of attention that scans for answers. Not the restless kind that keeps asking, what should I do next? But a softer, wider kind. A kind that simply notices what is, and stays with it, as if something in you finally grew tired of running in circles around the same questions and decided to sit down on the floor beside them. I notice how quiet it feels here. Not empty, not resolved, just spacious, as if the night itself has widened around whatever you're carrying. You don't have to hold everything so tightly right now. You don't have to make sense of your estrangement. You don't have to decide what your solitude means. You don't have to know where your life is going. You don't have to resolve your homelessness. You don't have to fix your relationships. You don't have to choose a new identity. You don't have to do anything at all. There's a strange relief in that, in realizing that nothing is being asked of you in this moment, except presence, except allowing yourself to be here, with whatever is real for you right now, without trying to turn it into a story with a moral, without trying to turn it into a problem with a solution, without trying to turn it into a failure or a victory, just letting it be a lived experience. I keep thinking about holding, about what it means to hold something that cannot yet be resolved. We're taught, in so many ways, that discomfort is a signal to act, that pain is a problem to be fixed, that confusion is a failure of understanding, that loneliness is a sign that something has gone wrong. But what if some experiences are not problems at all? What if they are thresholds? What if they are invitations to a different kind of consciousness? What if they are the psyche's way of expanding your capacity to live with complexity? I don't mean that in a romantic way. There is nothing romantic about estrangement. There is nothing beautiful about homelessness. There is nothing noble about loneliness. They hurt. They disorient. They exhaust. They hollow you out. And at the same time, they change you. They stretch you into a shape that your old life could not accommodate. And that stretching is not gentle. It doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't come with timelines. It doesn't come with guarantees. It just happens, and you have to find a way to live inside it. There's a quiet dignity in that, in staying with an experience that has no clear meaning yet, in refusing to prematurely close the question of your life, in allowing yourself to be in the middle of something without demanding that it immediately become something else. That kind of patience is not something our culture teaches us. We're taught to move on, to get over things, to fix things, to make things better, to optimize, to improve, to progress. And here you are, doing none of that. Here you are, simply inhabiting a strange, liminal space in your own life. And that is not nothing. There's something profoundly human about it. I notice how much pressure there is, even now, to turn everything you've been feeling into a narrative. A story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story where the estrangement leads to clarity, where the solitude leads to wisdom, where the homelessness leads to a new home, where the loneliness leads to deeper connection. And maybe it will, one day. But right now, that story doesn't exist yet. Right now, you're in the middle. And the middle is not a story. It's a mess. It's ambiguity. It's contradiction. It's grief mixed with relief. It's longing mixed with aversion. It's hope mixed with despair. It's the experience of holding opposites that refuse to be reconciled. And that, in a very quiet way, is what Jung once called the transcendent function. Not a solution, not a concept to be understood, but a lived tension between opposing realities that your psyche is learning to hold without collapsing into either one. You are holding the tension between belonging and solitude, between love and estrangement, between your old life and your emerging one, between who you were and who you are becoming, between wanting to go back and knowing you can't, between wanting to move forward and not knowing how. And something in you is learning how to stay inside that tension without breaking. That's not nothing. That's a form of psychological work that doesn't look like work at all. It looks like stillness. It looks like confusion. It looks like doing nothing. But inside, something is shifting. Something is reorganizing itself. Something is making space for a form of life that doesn't exist yet. And you don't get to see that process. You don't get to control it. You don't get to speed it up. You just get to live inside it. I keep thinking about companionship. about what it means to be accompanied in a moment like this. Not accompanied by answers, not accompanied by solutions, not accompanied by advice, but accompanied by presence, by someone or something willing to sit with you in the uncertainty without trying to rescue you from it. And that's what I'm trying to offer you here. Not guidance, not wisdom, not reassurance, just company. Just someone to sit beside you in this strange, quiet place where your life feels suspended between what was and what will be. You don't have to be brave right now. You don't have to be hopeful. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to be grateful. You don't have to be positive. You don't have to make meaning out of your suffering. You don't have to see the bigger picture. You don't have to trust the process. You don't have to do any of that. You just have to be here. Breathing. Existing. Carrying whatever you're carrying. And that is already more than enough. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, late at night or very early in the morning, when the world feels especially thin. The noise of the day has fallen away. The demands of other people are far away. The future is not yet pressing on you. And you're left alone with the raw fact of your own existence, your own consciousness, your own aliveness. And in that thin, quiet space, something shifts. Not dramatically, not decisively, just subtly. Your suffering loosens its grip a little. Not because it's gone, but because it's no longer being resisted. You're not fighting your estrangement. You're not trying to escape your solitude. You're not trying to solve your homelessness. You're just letting them be what they are. And in that letting be, something softens. Your shoulders drop. Your jaw unclenches. Your breath deepens. Not as an exercise, not as a technique, just as a natural response to not being under attack by your own mind. I notice how much gentler everything feels when you stop demanding resolution. When you stop telling yourself that your life needs to make sense right now. When you stop insisting that your suffering must have a clear purpose. When you stop measuring your inner state against some imaginary standard of how you're supposed to be feeling. There's a kind of peace that comes from giving up on the idea that you're supposed to be somewhere else. From giving up on the idea that this moment is a mistake. From giving up on the idea that your estrangement means your life has failed. It doesn't make the pain go away, but it changes your relationship to it. It turns pain from an enemy into a companion. Not a welcome companion. Not a comforting one, but a fellow traveler, walking beside you through a landscape that neither of you fully understands. There's something oddly tender about that. About the way your psyche is trying to care for you by slowing everything down, by pulling you into solitude, by stripping away distractions, by forcing you to confront the raw fact of your own existence. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it wants to reorganize you, because it knows that the old structures of your life no longer fit who you are. And it's trying to make space for something new, even if it doesn't know what that new thing is yet. I keep thinking about horizons, about how you can stand on a shoreline and look out at the ocean and know that there's something beyond what you can see. Not because you can see it, but because you know that the world doesn't end at the edge of your vision. Your life is like that right now. You're standing at the edge of what you know, at the edge of your old identity, at the edge of your old relational world, at the edge of your old meanings. And you can't see what's next. All you can see is the vast, open, uncertain expanse in front of you. And that is terrifying. And strangely full of possibility. Not the kind of possibility you can plan for. Not the kind you can optimize. Not the kind you can manifest. Just the quiet, existential possibility that something else might one day exist here. Something that fits you better. Something that resonates more deeply with who you are. Something that you can't imagine yet. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, When you realize that you're not actually alone in your solitude, that there is something in you that is holding you, something that has not abandoned you, something that is quietly accompanying you through this strange, dark passage. Call it your psyche, call it your deeper self, call it consciousness, call it life, call it whatever you want. But there is a presence here, a presence that is not judging you, not rushing you, not demanding that you be different, not abandoning you because you're confused or lonely or lost, just staying with you, breathing with you, existing with you, carrying you forward in time, even when you don't know where you're going. And that presence is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give you messages. It doesn't give you signs. It just continues, quietly, relentlessly, tenderly, keeping you alive, keeping you conscious, keeping you here. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has made you more gentle, more patient, more compassionate. Not in a performative way, in a deep, embodied way. You've learned what it feels like to be misaligned with the world, to be out of place, to be lonely in the presence of love. And that knowledge has softened something in you. It's made you less quick to judge other people, less quick to assume you know what their inner world looks like, less quick to demand that life conform to your expectations. And that softness is not nothing. It's a form of quiet wisdom that doesn't look like wisdom at all. It just looks like tiredness, like sadness, like humility, like surrender. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you're not supposed to understand your life right now. That the demand for understanding is itself a kind of violence against your own experience. That some phases of life are meant to be lived, not interpreted. That some transformations happen in darkness, not in clarity. That some meanings only emerge in retrospect, years later, from a place you can't imagine yet. And that realization takes some of the pressure off. It allows you to stop interrogating your suffering. Stop trying to extract lessons from it. Stop trying to justify it. And just let it be part of your life, part of your story, even if you don't know what story it belongs to yet. I notice how the night feels different now. Not because anything has been resolved, not because anything has changed, but because you've stopped fighting what is. And in that stopping, something in you has settled. Not into peace, not into comfort, just into a quieter, softer state of being. A state where your estrangement doesn't feel like an emergency, where your solitude doesn't feel like a catastrophe, where your homelessness doesn't feel like a failure. It just feels like your life, right now, as it is. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you don't actually need to know where your life is going in order to keep living it. That the demand for direction is a luxury your psyche cannot afford right now. That what it needs instead is presence, breath, time, gentleness. And that realization is strangely liberating, because it means you can stop trying to steer, stop trying to fix, stop trying to optimize, and just float. Not in a dissociative way, in a trusting way. Trusting that something in you knows how to carry you forward. Even if you don't, there's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be lived. And that mystery does not owe you clarity. It does not owe you resolution. It does not owe you a happy ending. It just is. And you are. And that is enough. For now, I don't have anything to tell you to do. I don't have any advice to give you. I don't have any answers for your questions. I don't have any solutions for your estrangement. I don't have any fixes for your loneliness. I don't have any maps for your future. I just have this quiet, steady presence. This willingness to sit with you in the not knowing, in the in-between, in the darkness, in the uncertainty, in the open horizon. And to say, without drama and without urgency, you're not alone in this moment. Even if you feel alone in your life, even if you feel estranged from everyone you love, even if you feel homeless in your own existence, you're not alone here. Right now, in this quiet space, in this breath, in this moment, we can just be here together for a little while, without trying to turn this into anything else, without trying to make it better, without trying to make it meaningful, without trying to make it end, just letting it be what it is, and trusting that something in you knows what to do with this time, even if you don't. And when you're ready, not because you should be, not because it's time, not because anything has been resolved, but simply because your body is tired enough to rest, you can let your eyes close, not as a technique, not as a ritual, just as a natural response to being held in this quiet presence. And if sleep comes, it comes. And if it doesn't, that's okay too. There's no hurry. There's nowhere you need to be. There's nothing you need to do. Your life will still be here when you wake up. Your questions will still be here. Your estrangement will still be here. Your solitude will still be here. And whatever is meant to emerge from all of this will still be slowly, quietly forming in the darkness. You don't have to watch it happen. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to help it. You just have to live inside it, breathing, being, here, now. With me, for a little while longer, morning comes differently now. Not like a revelation, not like a beginning, not even like a relief. It comes quietly, almost indifferently, as if the night simply loosened its grip a little and let the light leak back in through the same old cracks. You wake up and the world is still there. The same room, the same walls, the same objects waiting for your hands. Nothing dramatic has changed. And yet, something has. Not in a way you could explain to anyone. Not in a way that would make sense on a calendar. Not in a way that would justify any big decisions. Just a subtle difference in how your body inhabits the morning. How you sit on the edge of the bed a little longer than you used to. How you move through your kitchen a little more slowly. How you hold your cup of coffee or tea like it's something fragile, something that might spill if you grip it too tightly. It's not sadness, exactly. Not despair, not even grief in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter than that. A kind of ethical sadness. The sadness of realizing that your life is not going to resolve into a neat shape, that there will be loose ends, that there will be unanswered questions, that there will be unlived possibilities that never quite stop whispering, and that this is not a failure. It's just what a real human life looks like. You go about your morning routines, and they feel both familiar and strangely foreign. You brush your teeth, you make your bed, you feed the cat or the dog or yourself. You check your phone, and all of it feels slightly different now. Not because anything external has changed, but because you're carrying a different kind of awareness into these small acts. You're aware, in a way you weren't before, that your life is not a story that's building toward a climax. It's a series of ordinary days that will continue to arrive, one after another, regardless of whether you ever figure out what they mean. And there's something both sobering and oddly grounding about that. There's a kind of dignity in continuing to live an ordinary life after your inner world has been rearranged. In still washing dishes, in still answering emails, in still showing up to work, in still making dinner, in still paying bills. Not because everything is okay. Not because you've found your purpose, Not because your estrangement has resolved, but because this is the only life you have, and it keeps asking to be lived, even when it doesn't make sense anymore. I keep thinking about tools, about the way people repair things that are not broken beyond recognition. A loose hinge, a dripping faucet, a cracked step, a window that won't quite close. You don't replace the whole house when one door stops fitting properly. You adjust it, you sand it down, you tighten the screws. You live with a little unevenness, and something about that feels like a metaphor for what you're doing now with your life. You're not tearing everything down. You're not starting over. You're not blowing up your relationships. You're not reinventing yourself. You're just making small repairs. Tiny adjustments, micro renegotiations of meaning. You start saying no to things that drain you. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just quietly. You stop explaining yourself so much. You stop forcing yourself into conversations that leave you empty. You start protecting a little more space for your solitude, not because you're antisocial, but because you've learned that your inner world needs more room to breathe than it used to. You let certain relationships become a little looser, not out of anger, not out of resentment, just out of a quiet recognition that you don't have the energy to maintain the old level of intensity anymore. You start to live more gently, not because you've become wise, but because you've become tired in a very specific way. Tired of contorting yourself to fit into lives and relationships that no longer feel true to who you are. There's something strangely humble about this phase of life. It doesn't come with revelations. It doesn't come with breakthroughs. It doesn't come with clarity. It comes with small, almost invisible changes. You choose a different seat at the table. You take a different route home. You spend a little more time alone in the evenings. You stop going to certain social gatherings without making a big deal about it. You start going to bed earlier. You read different kinds of books. You listen to different kinds of music. You take longer walks. And none of these things feel like transformation. They just feel like survival. But not survival in a dramatic, desperate way. Survival in a quiet, almost domestic way. Like tending a small garden behind your house. You don't expect it to become a paradise. You don't expect it to fix your life. You just water it. You pull out weeds. You plant a few things. You see what grows. And that's enough. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you're no longer waiting for your life to start. You're not living in anticipation anymore. You're not postponing your real life until something changes. You're not telling yourself, when I figure this out, then I'll begin. You're just living. In an unfinished way. In a partial way. In a way that doesn't make sense on paper. And that realization is both liberating and deeply sad. Liberating because it frees you from the pressure to arrive somewhere. Sad because it means you're letting go of the fantasy that one day your life will make perfect sense. There's a particular grief in that, not the grief of losing something, the grief of outgrowing an illusion, the illusion that your life is supposed to resolve into a coherent narrative, that all the suffering will be justified, that all the estrangement will lead to wisdom, that all the loneliness will lead to deeper connection, that all the homelessness will lead to a new home. Maybe some of that will happen, but maybe not. And part of growing older is learning how to live with that uncertainty without turning it into despair. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be inhabited. And that shifts something fundamental in how you relate to your own existence. You stop asking, what is wrong with my life? And you start asking, How can I live inside this life more honestly? Not more successfully, not more productively, not more impressively, just more honestly. And that honesty doesn't lead you to dramatic decisions. It leads you to small ones. You stop pretending you're interested in things you're not interested in anymore. You stop forcing yourself to maintain relationships that drain you. You stop chasing goals that no longer feel meaningful. You stop punishing yourself for not wanting the life you used to want. And these small acts of honesty begin to accumulate, not into a new identity, not into a new life, just into a slightly different way of inhabiting the life you already have. There's something quietly radical about that. Not in a political sense, in a psychological sense. It's radical to stop living your life as if it's a performance for an invisible audience. It's radical to stop organizing your existence around expectations that no longer make sense to you. It's radical to live as if your inner world actually matters. Even if nobody else ever fully understands it, there's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you are never going to be the person you thought you would be. Not in a tragic way, in a matter-of-fact way. You had certain images of your future, certain fantasies, certain timelines, certain identities, and they didn't happen. Some of them couldn't have happened. Some of them were never realistic. Some of them were never really yours to begin with. And part of growing older is learning how to grieve those unlived lives without turning that grief into bitterness, without turning it into self-blame, without turning it into resentment toward the people who shared your life. There's a line Jung once wrote about the unlived life being the heaviest burden we carry. And you don't need to understand anything else about Jung to know that this is true. You feel it in your body, in the quiet ache that shows up sometimes when you think about the roads you didn't take, the relationships you didn't pursue, the talents you didn't develop, the courage you didn't have, the versions of yourself that never quite came into being. That ache doesn't go away. It just changes its tone. It becomes less sharp, less dramatic, more companionable. Like an old scar that still twinges when the weather changes. You carry it with you, and you learn how to live around it. There's something important about not trying to resolve that grief, not trying to turn it into a lesson, not trying to justify it, not trying to spiritualize it, just letting it be what it is, a sadness that belongs to a life that has been lived long enough to accumulate losses that were never officially losses. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not made you special. It has made you ordinary in a very deep way. Ordinary in the sense that you are now living the kind of life that most human beings live, once they get old enough. A life that does not add up neatly. A life that contains contradictions. A life that includes both gratitude and regret. A life that includes both love and loneliness. A life that includes both belonging and homelessness. And that ordinariness is strangely comforting. It means you're not broken. You're just human. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude has not turned you into a sage. It has turned you into someone who is more aware of your own limitations, more aware of how little control you actually have over your life, more aware of how fragile your sense of meaning really is. And that awareness doesn't make you enlightened. It makes you more humble, more gentle, more patient with yourself, with other people, with life. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not waiting for you to figure it out. It's happening right now, in this ordinary morning, in this quiet afternoon, in this unremarkable evening, in the way you fold your laundry, in the way you answer a text message, in the way you walk down the street, in the way you sit alone with your thoughts. And that realization shifts something in you. It makes you less preoccupied with the future, less haunted by the past, more present in the small, unglamorous moments that actually make up your life, not in a mindful, enlightened way, in a tired, practical way. You realize that this is it, not in a despairing sense, in a grounded sense. This is your life, as it is, not as you thought it would be, not as you hoped it would be, not as you planned it would be, just as it is. And you can either live inside it, or keep waiting for a different one that may never come. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has stripped away a lot of illusions. Illusions about control, illusions about permanence, illusions about certainty, illusions about being understood. And what's left is something much simpler, not easier, just simpler. You're alive, you're conscious, you're here. You're carrying an inner world that is larger than your life, and you're doing your best to live inside that mismatch with some dignity. There's something quietly heroic about that, not in a cinematic way, in a deeply human way. I keep thinking about embers, about how a fire doesn't have to be blazing to still be alive, how something can look like it's dying and still be carrying a quiet heat. Your life feels like that right now. Not on fire, not collapsing, just smoldering, carrying a quiet intensity that no one else can see, and you don't know what will happen to that heat, whether it will flare up again, whether it will slowly burn out, whether it will turn into something else entirely. And you don't need to know. You just need to tend it, gently, without drama, without expectation, without forcing. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you don't actually want a new life. You just want to live this one more honestly, more gently, more in alignment with who you are now. And that desire doesn't lead you to radical change. It leads you to small acts of care. You take better care of your body, not obsessively, just more respectfully. You take better care of your time. You stop wasting it on things that leave you empty. You take better care of your inner world. You give yourself more silence, more space, more solitude. And these small acts of care begin to add up, not into happiness, not into fulfillment, just into a life that feels a little less violent toward your own psyche. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has given you a strange kind of freedom. The freedom to stop pretending. The freedom to stop chasing illusions. The freedom to stop performing. The freedom to be unfinished. The freedom to not know what your life is about. The freedom to live without a clear narrative. And that freedom is not exhilarating. It's heavy. It comes with a lot of sadness, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of loneliness. But it also comes with a kind of quiet relief, relief from the pressure to be someone you're not anymore. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a project. It's not something you need to optimize. It's not something you need to perfect. It's not something you need to complete. It's something you need to inhabit. Day by day, moment by moment, with all of its incompleteness, with all of its contradictions, with all of its unresolved tensions. And that realization softens something in you. It takes some of the edge off your self-criticism. It takes some of the edge off your existential panic. It allows you to live a little more gently inside your own skin. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you don't need your life to make sense in order to keep living it. That meaning is not a prerequisite for existence. That coherence is not a requirement for dignity. That resolution is not necessary for worth. And that realization is strangely liberating, because it means you can stop waiting for clarity. Stop waiting for answers. Stop waiting for permission. And just live in an unfinished way. in a partial way, in a way that doesn't add up neatly, and that is enough. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not made you less human. It has made you more human, more aware of fragility, more aware of loss, more aware of impermanence, more aware of how much of life is out of your control. And that awareness doesn't make you happy, it makes you real. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude has not isolated you from life. It has brought you closer to it, closer to its rawness, closer to its uncertainty, closer to its ordinariness. And that closeness is not comforting. It's intimate, it's honest, it's unfiltered. And that intimacy changes how you relate to everything. You become less interested in distractions, less interested in noise, less interested in superficial connection, and more interested in what actually feels alive to you. Even if it's quiet, even if it's small, even if it doesn't look like much from the outside. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to turn into a redemption story. It's not going to resolve into a narrative of triumph. It's not going to justify all the suffering you've been through. And that's not a failure. It's just reality. And part of growing older is learning how to live inside that reality without turning cynical, without turning bitter, without turning numb. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that you don't actually need a different life. You need a different relationship to the life you have. And that shift is subtle. It doesn't show up on your resume. It doesn't show up on social media. It doesn't show up in other people's perceptions of you. It just shows up in the quiet way you inhabit your own existence. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement is not something that's going to end. It's something you're going to learn how to carry, not as a wound, not as a tragedy, just as a fact about who you are now. And that realization is strangely stabilizing, because it means you can stop waiting for it to go away. Stop organizing your life around the fantasy of its resolution, and start living with it as part of your inner weather. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a journey toward completion. It's a process of becoming. And becoming does not have an endpoint. It just continues, quietly, ordinarily, unremarkably. And that realization changes how you think about the future. It stops being something you're building toward, and starts being something you're moving through, day by day. Without a clear destination, there's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not taken anything away from you that you were guaranteed to have. It has just taken away illusions. Illusions about control. Illusions about certainty. Illusions about belonging. And what's left is a life that is more fragile, more uncertain, more incomplete, but also more honest. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not supposed to feel like home all the time. That there are phases of life that feel like exile, like homelessness, like wandering, and that those phases are not mistakes. They are just part of what it means to be alive long enough to change. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not ruined your life. It has altered it, and alteration is not the same thing as destruction. It's just change. Not always the kind you wanted. Not always the kind you asked for. But change nonetheless. And you're learning how to live inside it. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude has not failed you. It has held you when nothing else could. It has given you a place to breathe when your relational world felt suffocating. It has given you a place to be real when your social world felt performative. And that matters. Even if it doesn't solve anything, there's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to offer you closure. Not about your past, not about your relationships, not about your choices, not about your identity. And that lack of closure is not a sign that your life is broken. It's just a sign that your life is ongoing. And ongoing things are always unfinished. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has given you a deeper relationship with time. You no longer rush as much. You no longer expect things to resolve quickly. You no longer believe that change follows a neat timeline. And that patience is not something you cultivated deliberately. It's something your life forced you to learn. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not waiting for you to become someone else. It's waiting for you to live as the person you already are, not the person you thought you would be, not the person you hoped you would be, not the person you planned to be, just the person you are now. And that realization is quietly devastating and quietly liberating. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not taken away your capacity for meaning. It has just stripped away easy meanings, cheap meanings, borrowed meanings. And what's left is a more difficult, more fragile kind of meaning. The kind you have to live into slowly, without guarantees, without applause, without certainty. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a puzzle that will eventually make sense. It's a story that will only ever be partially told, even to you. And that's not a tragedy. It's just the nature of consciousness. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not isolated you from humanity. It has brought you closer to its deepest condition, the condition of being a conscious being in a world that does not fully make sense. The condition of carrying an inner world that no one else can fully inhabit. The condition of living a life that will always be, in some way, unfinished. And that realization connects you, quietly, to every other human being who has ever lived long enough to feel this way. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not supposed to resolve into peace. It's supposed to continue. With all of its tensions, with all of its contradictions, with all of its unanswered questions. And that continuation is not something you earn. It's something that happens to you. As long as you're alive, there's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not broken you. It has made you more porous, more open, more aware, more vulnerable. And that vulnerability is not a weakness. It's a form of contact with reality. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a performance. It's not something you're doing for anyone else. It's not something that has to make sense to anyone else. It's something you're living, quietly, ordinarily, unremarkably, and that is enough. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not ended your story. It has just moved it into a different chapter. Not a better one, not a worse one, just a different one. And you don't know what this chapter is about yet. And you don't need to. You just need to live it, day by day, moment by moment, with whatever honesty you can manage. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not something you need to fix. It's something you need to carry. And carrying is different from fixing. Fixing implies an endpoint. Carrying implies a relationship, a way of being with something that is not going away. And your estrangement is something you are learning how to carry, not as a burden, not as a wound, just as a fact about who you are now. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude has not made you less capable of love. It has made you more selective, more honest, more aware of what you can and cannot give. And that selectivity is not cruelty. It's integrity. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to offer you a grand reconciliation between your past and your present, between your hopes and your reality, between your inner world and your outer world. And that lack of reconciliation is not a failure. It's just the nature of time. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not taken away your capacity for joy. It has just changed what joy looks like. Joy becomes quieter, smaller, more fleeting, less spectacular, and more precious. You find it in moments you would have overlooked before, in the way the light falls on your kitchen floor, in the sound of a bird outside your window, in the warmth of your cup in your hands, in a line of a book that feels like it was written for you. And those small joys don't fix anything, but they make living possible. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not something you can complete. It's something you will leave unfinished. No matter what you do, no matter how well you live, no matter how much you understand. And that realization is not depressing. It's humbling. It puts your existence into a different perspective. It makes you less demanding of life, less demanding of yourself, less demanding of meaning. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has given you a strange kind of clarity. Not about what to do, not about who to be, but about what you no longer want. And that negative clarity is powerful. It narrows your life in a way that feels like relief. You stop chasing things that don't matter to you anymore. You stop trying to impress people who don't really see you. You stop investing in identities that no longer feel true. And that narrowing creates a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom to do anything, the freedom to stop doing a lot of things. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a path toward happiness. It's a path toward deeper contact with reality. And reality is not organized around your comfort. It's organized around change, loss, impermanence. And your estrangement has forced you into closer contact with that reality. Not in a mystical way, in a very ordinary, very human way. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your solitude has not made you irrelevant. It has made you more inwardly alive, even if that aliveness is quiet, even if no one else sees it, even if it doesn't lead to anything. And that aliveness matters. Even if it never becomes anything else, there's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a rehearsal. It's not something you're practicing for. It's not something that will eventually begin. It's happening now, in this ordinary day, in this unfinished life. And that realization changes how you inhabit the present. You stop waiting. You stop postponing. You stop telling yourself, later. And you start living now. Not in a dramatic, seize the day way. In a quiet, resigned, deeply human way. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not made your life smaller. It has made it deeper. Not richer, not happier, just deeper. More complex, more layered, more honest. And that depth is not something you would have chosen, but it's something you now have to live with. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to give you a clear answer to the question, What is this all about? And that question is not going to go away. And that's not a failure. It's just the nature of consciousness. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not taken away your future. It has just made your future less predictable, less narratable, less containable. And that unpredictability is frightening and strangely alive. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not something you need to explain. Not to other people, not to yourself. It's something you need to live. And that realization takes some of the pressure off. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not isolated you from meaning. It has forced you to create your own. Slowly, quietly, without guarantees, without applause, without certainty. And that creation is not something you do once. It's something you do every day, in small, almost invisible ways. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to become simple again. And that simplicity is not something you need to get back to. It's something you've outgrown. And that realization is both sad and freeing. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not taken away your capacity for hope. It has just stripped away naive hope, easy hope, guaranteed hope. And what's left is a quieter, more fragile kind of hope. The hope that you can continue to live honestly inside an unfinished life. And that hope is not something you feel all the time. It's something you live into. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to give you closure. And that closure is not something you need in order to keep living. And that realization changes how you relate to your own suffering. It makes it feel less like an emergency and more like a companion. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not ruined your capacity for belonging. It has just made you more aware of how rare real belonging actually is. And that awareness makes you more careful with your heart, more patient, more selective. And that selectivity is not cynicism, it's wisdom. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a destination. It's a condition of being alive long enough to change. And that realization puts everything into a different light. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not taken away your life. It has given you a different one, not a better one, not a worse one, just a different one. And you don't get to choose whether you like it, you just get to choose how you live inside it. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not something you need to master. It's something you need to be in relationship with. And that relationship is not always loving, not always kind, not always gentle, but it's real, and it's yours. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not ended your capacity for growth. It has just changed what growth looks like. Growth now looks like patience, like restraint, like letting go, like not knowing, like living with unanswered questions. And that kind of growth is not glamorous. It doesn't look like success. It looks like endurance. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not a project you're working on. It's a reality you're inhabiting, and that shift in perspective changes everything. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your estrangement has not made your life meaningless. It has made meaning harder, more fragile, more provisional. And that fragility is not a defect, it's a feature of being conscious. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not going to resolve into peace. And that peace is not something you need in order to keep living. And that realization softens something in you. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, When you realize that your estrangement has not broken your story. It has complicated it, and complication is not the same thing as failure. There's a moment that comes, sometimes, when you realize that your life is not something you need to justify. It's something you need to live, quietly, ordinarily, unfinished. And that is enough. So when this quiet, ordinary afternoon continues, when the light shifts, when the sounds of the world come back in, when you get up from wherever you're sitting, when you go back into your life, nothing will be resolved, nothing will be fixed, nothing will be concluded. Your estrangement will still be there. Your solitude will still be there. Your homelessness will still be there. Your unanswered questions will still be there. And your life will still be there too, asking to be lived. Not perfectly, not heroically, just honestly. And that's what you'll keep doing, living forward, carrying what you carry, making small repairs, tending quiet embers, leaving thresholds open, and continuing. Not because everything makes sense, not because you've arrived, but because you're alive. And this is your life, as it is, right now, and tomorrow, and the day after that, and that has to be enough. For now.